Good afternoon and welcome to this Jerusalem Press Club briefing. I'm Esti Yaari, Press Director of the club. We are joined today by Ambassador Dr. Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy minister and minister of the Knesset. And Ambassador Oren is also a historian who has written a number of books on Israeli military and diplomatic history. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Esti. Hi.
Hi. I had prepared an introduction yesterday, and then I had prepared another one this morning based on events, and another one an hour and a half ago. And I kind of feel like everything keeps changing. Possibly in another minute or two, I'll need to prepare something different. And so just kind of very quickly, I'll say, here we are on day 12 of Operation Rising Lion. Overnight, President Trump declared a ceasefire, which Iran broke today by sending ballistic missiles to Israel. President Trump warned Israel not to retaliate. There was a conversation between the president and the prime minister. Israel hit a radar site north of Tehran, and we appear to be back in some kind of uneasy ceasefire once again. I don't know if you agree with my very, very quick version of what just happened, but I'm wondering if you can help us make sense of what's going on. How did we get here?
Okay, good to be with you, Esti. I think that generally speaking, you have to distinguish between military victories in this war, diplomatic victories, and strategic victories. Militarily, in pure military terms, whether in Gaza, whether in Lebanon, or now in Iran, Israel has achieved a military victory. In virtually every respects, even in Gaza, the military victory has been extraordinary, and will be studied in West Point and other military academies around the world for generations to come. Even in Gaza, where Hamas remains a considerable force in parts of the Gaza Strip, no other army in modern history has ever encountered 30,000 terrorists in a densely built-up area of 2.2 million people with 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath. It's never been encountered by any army in military history. And the IDF acquitted itself very, very impressively there in Lebanon, even in Yemen, which has been very quiet in the last couple of days, if you've noticed, and in Iran. Iran is a military achievement that is unparalleled and probably remain so for a very long time. Strategically, there is a big question. So strategically, Israel has achieved a victory over Hamas and Hezbollah because they don't pose a strategic threat anymore. They could be, they could fire a rocket here and there. They can carry out a terrorist attack here and there, but they're not a strategic threat anymore. Iran, as of last night, appears to have also suffered a strategic threat. That Iran is not the threat it was 12 days ago to Israel, and certainly not the threat it was on October 7th, 2023. Certainly not, because Israel has not only eliminated its quote-unquote ring of fire, it has now humbled Iran itself, humiliated the regime, knocked out well over half of its missile firing capacities, its arsenals, and severely damaged many facilities, military, some of them actually political because the line is blurred, of the IRGC, symbols of the regime, even prison, the besieged headquarters, eliminated nuclear scientists, generals, heads of intelligence, and then the United States joining with its B-2 strike the other night, bombing apparently successful, I don't know to the full extent of that success, the Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow facilities. So now you have this military victory. You have a military victory and a strategic victory over Hamas and Hezbollah. Can you sustain both the military and strategic victory over Iran? And that's really what hangs in the balance this morning, because anybody listened to the president's most recent remark about Israel's attempt to respond to Iranian violations of the ceasefire, which were quite lethal, may wonder whether Iran will able to fulfill its pledge made this morning to rebuild its nuclear facilities, to rebuild its missile capacity. Iran regime declared victory. And if Iran is allowed to rebuild everything it lost in the last 12 days, then in a certain way it will be a victory. Victory for Israel, and I believe very strongly victory for the United States, looks something like this, that not only does this war end with Iran deprived of the so-called right to enrich uranium and the ability to enrich uranium, the war ends with an end to Iran's support for terror worldwide. It's the largest state sponsor of terror. Ends Iran's sponsorship of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Ends Iran's attempt to undermine Syria's sovereignty, Lebanese sovereignty. Ends with the opening toward peace between Israel and Lebanon, peace between Israel and Syria, not just with Israel and Saudi Arabia. It ends with a thoroughly different Middle East, a very different Middle East. That's what victory would look like. That victory is only possible if Israel and the United States work in lockstep into the next phase. The war, Esty, was always going to end. We all knew how it began, but it was always going to end around the negotiating table. And now we've left the battlefield, has moved from the battlefield to that negotiating table. And this is where everything hangs in the balance. Everything hangs in the balance. And I think one of the crucial components of successful negotiations at the negotiating table would be a ironclad Israeli-American agreement to deny Iran the ability to rebuild these facilities, to deny Iran the ability to restore its missile capability, to deny Iran the ability, its ability to fund terror around the Middle East and the world. That's what victory would look like. At the end of the day, I think America came out looking very good. America has restored much of its deterrence power in the world, put a large share of the trauma of Iraq and Afghanistan behind it. I think people in Beijing tonight are thinking twice, make a military move on Taiwan. And I think the fact that Russia and China didn't offer much help to Iran during this period. I think that's the result of America flexing its muscles and showing its will to and readiness to project power on a significant basis. For Israel, though, it remains a question whether we can transform the military and strategic victories we've achieved, Gaza, Lebanon, certainly in Syria, the fall of the Assad government, and now in Iran, if we can transform it into permanent victories. That is the big question this afternoon. Okay.
Thank you. That was a really interesting kind of broad perspective on some what's been going on, and I'd like to drill down on some of what you touched on. You talked a little bit about the negotiating table, and we know that people keep referring to Iran. It is always said that it plays a long game, and so the fact that they have come now in their agreement to a ceasefire, which they subsequently broke, but we'll put that aside for the moment. Is this part of a long-term strategy to rebuild? And is the United States really, does it have the stomach, so to speak, for ensuring that, in fact, Iran does not try and rebuild the nuclear capability, of course, on the assumption that they no longer have
one? Declaratively, the president had said that the airstrikes of the other night were a one-off. It was a one-time operation. Whereas preventing Iran from rebuilding its nuclear strikes may require ongoing military activity, and it will only be effective. You can impose more punishing sanctions on Iran, but at the end of the day, there has to be a credible military threat on the table. The Iranians have withstood decades of sanctions. It doesn't mean they don't pay a punishing price. They do. But decades of sanctions. There has to be a credible military threat. President Trump is the only president, really going back to George Bush, who put a credible military threat on the table vis-a-vis Iran and actually exercised it. So he has a track record. We cannot ignore public opinion in the United States, which is running very, very high against continued American military involvement in this war. And I had advanced a theory, which I don't think is entirely wrong, during the course of the war, that I could conceive of a situation in which the Iranians would want America to intervene militarily, that they would do sort of, I don't know if it's the appropriate term, a Hail Mary, that if the regime felt its back was up against the wall and had no choice, it would call in an American artillery bombardment on their own position. They would shoot at an American base or American warship and get the United States to bomb them. And that would have created great dissent within the United States. It would have deepened the divisions with the Republican Party, would have put tremendous pressure on the president, and the president in turn would have put pressure on Israel. We're not that far off from that, because what is going on today is that the president's putting pressure on Israel. He wants to maintain the ceasefire. He knows that any further fighting would not only call into question his diplomacy, but it would risk involving America in a deeper, longer-term military involvement in the region, which for which, as you said, I'm going to quote you, as the Americans have no stomach.
Well, okay. Um,
Mhm.
so following up on what you've just said, the president had before called for unconditional surrender.
Mhm.
And, then a day later, we have the ceasefire that he called for, where he said, very clearly, please do not violate it. At the same time, he seems to be giving Iran a pass on its violations. So I'm wondering if you can maybe shed some light on that. Is it just because, like you said, he wants to maintain, the diplomacy that he's gotten rolling here, or what's going on here?
I don't know. I don't know. It's very difficult to second guess the president. It's a moving goalpost. I don't know. Yes, he said call for unconditional surrender. He also said he wanted to negotiate again. Yes, he called for regime change the other day, and yet he is last night giving out compliments to the regime. So I don't know. I can't pretend to know. And I have to say those three words that no analyst ever wants to say is, I don't know. But all I do know is, and this is what we have to go with what we do know. We know he doesn't like military involvements. He wants to get out of one if he can. He wants to be a peacemaker. He wants to be a deal maker. Um, and the question for Israel would be the degree to which Israel's vital interests can be preserved in the deal. Um, And in this way, it's not much different than where we were back in 2015, where we were concerned that Obama would strike a deal with the Iranians and Israel's interests would not be preserved in that deal. They weren't. But the big difference was Israel was not around the table back then. Here, Israel has an opportunity to be around the table and to try to coordinate to the greatest degree possible our position with America's. And we should be very, very clear what our goals are. And I've um, illustrated them this afternoon, and saying that our goal should be not just the denial of Iran's right to enrich and its ability to enrich, but to end Iran's support for terror and end its role as the major source of instability, violence, and war in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I don't know if we'll ever get a chance like this again.
Indeed, and I think also the difference between, of course, now and 2015 is the situation of Israel having kind of taken out so much the Iranian air defenses, the damage to the Iranian nuclear sites, even if they're not fully taken out, they're certainly damaged. The situation on the ground has shifted quite a lot. And I don't think, Israeli policymakers certainly spoke about the fact that regime change would be a nice side effect to everything that's going on, but that was not the actual goal. And so certainly they were going to pull back at some point. But after October 7th, the Israeli policymakers seem to be saying, we're not going to get used to breaches of ceasefires anymore. We're not going to allow the drip drab of missiles. And so where do you think this puts Israel vis-a-vis the United States and Iran, if Iran does in fact either continue with missile fire or with other targets? Iran, as you know, and as you said, they are supporters of terrorism. They have killed more Americans than I don't know which other regime in recent memory. And of course, Israelis and Jews around the world. So how does Israel then deal with this kind of dilemma that they're in? Whereas, you don't want to get in the way of President Trump's diplomacy. On the other hand, we can't allow getting used to this idea of a drip drab of attacks.
I think you said it, a major terrorist organization to build up on our borders, to build basically a terror mini state on our borders and threaten us in that way. We can vow to not let Iran pose the same manner or magnitude of threat that it did in the past. The question is, to what degree do we have American backing in fulfilling our pledge? Because at the end of the day, Israel needs bombs. Israel needs jet fuel. Israel needs what I call a diplomatic iron dome that's going to protect us from the UN Security Council and other less friendly disposed international organizations. And that is a huge question. And I don't pretend to have the answer for it. All I know is that this is something we have to strive for. And because it's crucial for our security, if even potentially our existence, This is a make it or break it issue. And I wrote an article the other day for Ynet. I write a weekly column for Ynet Media, and I said that I must say rather presciently, I said that this was going to be Netanyahu's golden moment. Now, a little bit of ancient history here. In the end of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger put pressure, immense pressure on Golda to enforce a ceasefire in which the IDF would refrain from surrounding Egypt's Third Army in the Sinai Peninsula. This is Arik Sharon, doing an end run through what they called Africa on the other side of the Suez Canal. And Golda resisted that pressure, resisted it until Arik Sharon completed the encirclement of the Egyptian army, and that greatly strengthened our hand at the negotiating table. That war was also going to end at the negotiating table, a place called Kilometer 101. And I said this now well over a week ago that this coming would be Bibi's Golda moment, where the president was going to say stop, and the prime minister might have to say, well, we can't. It's a matter of fundamental national security for us. So it's not my role to ask you a question, Esty, but what would you, if you were the prime minister, what would you do if you learned in the next hour that Iran is rebuilding Fordow, or that
I
Iran
daily
is
think,
importing missiles from China? I don't know. Its airport's open. Here they come. Do you sit back and let them do this at the risk of confronting the president of the United States? This is why, whatever you think about Benjamin Netanyahu, whatever you think, and no, I don't think anybody has a neutral thought about him, you have to wake up in the morning and say a little prayer that you're not in his shoes.
and I do, actually, I have to say, I'm grateful to be my prime minister, because these are very, very serious dilemmas with great repercussions, for sure, both for Israel and
Yep.
the region generally. Two questions to follow up on that have come in on this. One relates to the fact that they're saying, whatever you think of Prime Minister Netanyahu, many in Israel prior to all of what was going on had been criticizing the Prime Minister and Minister Dermer for, quote, ruining the relationship with the United States. After the attack on Fordow, President Trump's actions and statements seemed to put that idea to rest. And now we have this kind of, once again, discussion. So the question is being asked, how deep and how far back do you think the prime minister and president's coordination is? And how tight is that going forward? Is the bromance still happening? Is it dead?
Again, this is going to be, I don't know. What I do know is that the prime minister and Minister Ron Dermer did an extraordinary job of maintaining, strengthening ties with this administration. And the degree that there has been coordination and extraordinary coordination, they deserve an immense amount of credit. Immense amount of credit. Whether this continues in the coming crucial days and weeks is yet to be seen. It's yet to be seen. Whether it applies to other fields such as Gaza, and I think there's an opportunity to, if there's a coordination between Israel and the United States to resolve the Gaza issue, to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, certainly to redeem every single last one of our hostages. This is part of that opportunity that I mentioned later. Maybe for Israel, it's the most immediate and necessary opportunity is addressing Gaza and the hostage situation. That all has to be navigated very, very carefully. And we can. But the president is representing American interests, and American Israeli interests don't always dovetail as much as we try. Nor can they be. America's a superpower far away from the Middle East. We are a tiny power in the Middle East, and we have to work very, very hard to maintain this. I mean, long term, though, I think we have to begin to rebuild our relationship with the Democratic Party as well. And I know I spent a lot of time doing this, and that bipartisan support for Israel remains a paramount national security interest for the state of Israel, and we have to work to preserve it. And it's been seriously impaired in recent years, weakened.
Okay, I'd
Hope
like
that
to
helped.
ask a few questions that have come in related to some of the things that you've spoken about, and to expand on some of those things. One, actually from Iran International, is asking about regime change. Prime Minister Netanyahu and even President Herzog seem stoked about the idea of the Ayatollahs disappearing. Kind of feels like the White
So
House. The White House is a bit wishy-washy on what's next. What do you think the world up to regarding regime change in Iran? And what kind of help would they give Iranians if Iranians start protesting again? And I would add to that, we haven't really seen big internal protests. And in the past, the regime has brutally crushed these protests inside Iran.
mhm.
What would protest movements to succeed?
Well, it's difficult to talk about protests right now. The population of Tehran and other cities has been fleeing, and there's no internet connection, so it's very difficult to organize. Opposite on the assumption that there are significant oppositional elements within Iran, I would also proceed on the assumption that some of those oppositional elements assisted us in our military campaign. We had a tremendous amount of in-depth intelligence from Iran, and this must have at least some of it must have been from local sources. Can't all have been from our spies penetrating. Um, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has made no attempt to dissemble his wish for the overthrow of the Iranian regime. He has several times called for the Iranian people to rise up and throw off the oppressive yoke of the Ayatollahs. The fact that the IAF in the last round of bombing bombed not strategically important facilities or military facilities, it bombed symbols of the regime. Evin Prison, they hated Evin Prison. The headquarters of the Besiege, this very big group of thugs that is used to suppress domestic opposition. That's interesting, and it's that for many Iranians and even those who deeply resent the United States and Israel for our actions militarily over the last 12 days, um, I think the Iranian citizens understand that this regime is not a paper. It's not a paper tiger. It's a tissue tiger, and while this is not a case of Libya or Iraq, state making of an army coming in and overthrowing a government and trying to make a state. No, but it is generating the situation in which the Iranian people themselves can make a change. And I think that's the hope. And it's not going to happen from today to tomorrow. If it happens tomorrow, I'll certainly be delighted. If it happens to today, I'll even be more delighted. But I think it's a long-term proposition. And we can that way hope for the best. But again, if this Iran is Iran is on the mat, okay? If it's allowed to get off the map, the chances of this happening and the chances of our preventing a return to the circumstances surrounding October 7th, 2023, will be much greater.
Um, So I want to then ask a couple more questions regarding that have come in regarding Israel's military operations in Iran right now. One is related to, as you mentioned, very good kind of penetration intelligence-wise of what's going on there. And the question that's being asked is will their deep intelligence penetration of Iran remain? The regime has already announced purges inside Iran, and how likely is Israel to lose some of its intelligence foothold in the wake of this war?
I don't think so. I don't think we're going to lose intelligence. I think that Iran is penetrated to a degree that Iranian leaders can't trust anybody around them. I think it has greatly impeded their ability to govern, even to govern. And there will be purges inside Iran. You could have seen civil strife within Iran. There are a lot of unknowns, a lot of unknowns. And all I can do is express that hope that we can get through this prudently, successfully, and achieve the long-term military, diplomatic, and strategic interests, which are the ultimate interests of both Israel, the United States, the Middle East, and the world.
Another journalist is asking about the military air superiority in Iran. Can we see a scenario in which Israeli planes continue to operate over Tehran, much as they do over Syria today?
Only without at least a yellow light from the United States.
Okay. And I want to ask you also, you had another question. You had mentioned the allies, Russia and China, early on when we first
Right.
started chatting. The Iranians had invested quite a bit, both in their proxies, which are much less lethal now, thankfully, and also in their allies, like Russia and China and others. And yet when it came down to it, they were not helpful at their time of need, at least not overtly so. So I guess the question that is being asked is, was this a bad investment? Over the years, certainly the proxies have been quite successful in Iran's goal of murdering Israelis, Jews, Americans, and anybody else. But when Iran was being beat
But
up,
from whose perspective? From the Russians or Chinese perspective, or from the people of Iran's perspective? From the people
well,
of
I guess
Iran's perspective, it was emphatically a terrible investment. Okay, they lost billions and billions and billions investing in terror, investing in nuclear program. Very bad investment. For the Chinese, it's something very different. Listen, the Chinese economy, which has been very wobbly, is heavily, heavily dependent on Iranian oil. And so the Iranians may want to respond to Israeli actions by blockading the Straits of Hormuz, but it's going to be a self-inflicted wound. That's the last thing the Chinese want. And the Chinese do not have a strategic military presence in the Mediterranean. It's not like the old Soviet blue water fleet that went eyeball to eyeball with the Sixth Fleet in 1967 and again in 1973. The Chinese are not here. And neither are the Russians to any great degree either anymore. So even their ability to respond in the Middle East is very limited, very limited. And so this leaves a pretty wide open field for American activity, as it did. There was no opportunity, no action. So I think the relationships there between Russia and China, it's not as if they share an ideology. They don't. And certainly not a theology. Iran sells missiles and drones to Russia for use against Ukraine. China buys oil, and China has signed a $400 billion 25-year agreement with Iran, exchanging oil for Chinese to a small degree diplomatically, but militarily and strategically, it's not here. Not yet. Not yet. So that's where it stands. This really remains an American sphere in every way, militarily, diplomatically. It's an American sphere. And it was suggested by several people to me last night. I didn't respond, but suggested that Putin be invited in as a mediator.
that seems like I don't know. What do you think of that idea? But okay, I seem to be having sound issues. Don't know if it's just on my end. We'll hold for one moment, and we'll see if the technical issues will be fixed.
Yeah. That's my end.
Okay, Ambassador, can you hear me now?
I hear you fine.
Okay, great. So I was asking you what you thought of that idea of bringing Russia into the negotiations.
The idea was that Putin, actually responded in a very restrained way to Israel. Had this remark that that Israel is half a Russian country with 2 million Russian speakers.
Right.
I know. I go on Russian media an awful lot. They're great. But the idea was that he could be a sort of a person who has relations with Iran and person who has a relationship with Israel. But I didn't subscribe to this, but people did come to me. Several people came to me and said this.
Okay, I have a couple of more follow-up questions. One is considering the bad investment in the proxies. Do you believe that the regime, which is still in power, will revert to or return to this policy of investing again, trying to build up again its proxies for perhaps attacks around the world?
Iran, the regime, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, are jihadist regimes. There's your jihadists. They have a theology. They share a common goal of recreating the medieval caliphate in the Middle East, and expanding that caliphate to global proportions. The only difference between them is that the caliphate will be Shiite under the Iranians, and under all the rest would be under Sunni. It would be Sunni. That is their DNA. That is their raison d'être. We tried to change that DNA with Hamas by using Qatari money or allowing workers, Palestinian workers, to come to Israel. It didn't work. It emphatically didn't work. True. The Obama administration sought to incentivize the Iranians through sanctions relief, through recognizing Iran's right to enrich uranium, finally to signing the JCPOA in 2015, with the expectation, here I quote President Obama, that Iran would become a responsible regional power. We were wrong about Hamas. The United States was wrong about Iran. This is what they are. This is what they are. They are not going to change. All you can do is hem them in diplomatically, hem them in financially, lots of observers, lots of surveillance, and always, always keeping a credible military threat on the table. It's the only way you can hedge them in. Otherwise, they're never going to change. And given the opportunity, they will always act on their DNA. They always will. So if anybody thinks, tomorrow they're going to get some kind of deal where, I don't know, something looks like dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program, but isn't, or denying the right to enrich, which isn't, but involves sanctions relief, I guarantee you, I'm not pledging, I'm not speculating, I guarantee you that money is going to be going to support terror around the world, and particularly against the state of Israel. No doubt.
Yeah, and considering the fact that you're saying you need to keep a credible military threat on the table, a journalist is asking here as well, in your view, is it necessary for Israel to not hold to the ceasefire now that that President Trump has announced? Or are you talking about longer term, in case the regime starts rebuilding its nuclear program and missile program?
And the answer to that is both yes. If Iran violates the ceasefire, Israel's going to have to make a decision. Do we respond to the violation of the ceasefire? And doing so, do we risk friction with the Trump administration? And you're going to have to weigh the two. Remember, I go back to saying the little blessing that you're not in Bibi's shoes, because that's a very hard call. Long term, of course, Israel has to act to ensure that Iran cannot rebuild these facilities. It would be the equivalent of letting Hezbollah build south of the Litani River. And so far, we haven't been doing that. We haven't allowed them to rebuild. And they will try. They will try all the time, just like Hezbollah is trying all the time. All right. Iran will try. They'll start today. They'll start today. They won't wait.
So talking again about the proxies, some follow-ups have come in. Will Israel then continue treating each proxy as a separate actor, do you think? And then tied into this, another question relating to the proxies is, how can Israel take advantage of its military victory against Iran and all of its proxies the report is asking here, to end the war in Gaza, guaranteeing the release of the hostages?
Again, it has to do with they're all linked. We certainly treat each front in a certain way as separate fronts, whether it's Hamas Gaza, Hamas West Bank, Hezbollah Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, but they're all linked through Iran. And so, it's the old head of the snake cliche. If you decapitate the snake, or you certainly knock him very, very hard on the head, and promise to keep hitting him hard on the head if he threatens to bite, then the position, our ability to force Hamas to accept favorable terms for a ceasefire and release the hostages becomes much greater. And it was my hope that at that negotiating table, the Americans would say to the Iranians, you want some sanctions relief? We'll give you sanctions relief, but every single one of the hostages has to be released in 1 hour. And Hamas leaders have to get on a boat and go somewhere. I personally would like to send them to Ireland.
So a reporter is asking a question.
They seem to love them. They seem to love them. They can have them. Mm-hmm.
Pretty there anyway.
Right.
A reporter is asking a question that I believe you touched on quite a bit, and so I don't know whether we need to approach the entire thing, but I do want to ask at least part of what he asked here, which is why, and I guess when Israel took the decision to broaden its strikes from strategic targets, from strictly nuclear sites, military officials, scientists, etc., and the missile production program, to these other symbols of the regime that you had discussed earlier.
Well,
Was
as I
that
said earlier, it's psychological warfare. It's showing, it's the emperor's new clothes. It's exposing the weakness of the regime, and by knocking their symbols, we expose them significantly, and it's encouraging opposition elements within the society to rise up.
so I guess we're gonna see, we're gonna have to wait and see what happens, is what I'm taking from.
You don't have to wait that long. You can wait by about 45 minutes, the way things have been progressing here. So,
Exactly, exactly. It's very hard to keep up, very hard to keep up. And so I know that, during these very, very dynamic and busy days, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure.
Oh, one second, another question is just arriving in from a reporter. I will ask their question and then I will let you go to your next meeting. I know,
We got them.
coming soon, right? I know you've got to run. But there's a feeling amongst, some Israelis that this is a kind of another Seventh, just another round, so to speak, which is of course leaving
Yeah.
some people feeling quite bitter about these things, particularly with the, with the strike in Beersheba this morning. Iran has targeted the civilian centers and unfortunately 28 people were murdered, hundreds more were injured. What do you think? Do you think this is the correct feeling to have?
It's a good question to answer. It's a good question to end on. Some years ago, my friend Jeffrey Goldberg, the head of the editor of Atlantic, after one of our many wars with Hamas along the border, said, "I get what the tactics are, but what's the strategy of Israel?" And I said to him, "Jeff, you don't understand. The tactic is the strategy, meaning that ever since this state was created in 1948, every couple of years, our enemies are going to try to destroy us, and we have to turn around and remind them that attempts to destroy us are not a good idea. And it's painful, but we have to do it every couple of years. But in between that time, we develop one of the most successful and advanced societies on the planet. We don't we don't stagnate. Our enemies stagnate, but we don't. And this has been the case for 77 years, a long time. Now, for the first time, truly for the first time that I can remember, that pattern can change. That the tactic won't be the strategy, but the strategy will be the strategy. And that strategy is changing the nature of this conflict entirely. But it requires vision, it requires statecraft, and it requires courage.
And on that note, we're going to hope that
Okay?
all of our leaders have all of those things. I'd like to thank you very, very much for your time,
Sure.
Dr. Ambassador Dr. Michael Oren. I'd like to thank my colleagues Matthias Sakel and Jonathan Beck for facilitating this, and of course all the journalists for joining us. It's just a reminder to our journalist friends, if you need anything that we can help with as you cover the region here, please feel free to be in touch. Have a good evening, everybody.
Take care. Be well. Thanks, JTP.
Thank you.
PZ. Bye.